one absolutely crucial attribute, has already been mentioned, was a central purpose of Sir Roger Giles, the former director of NatCen and the founder of PSA and indeed of NatCen, was that the survey should be able to chart long-term trends in public opinion. And in particular, what he was interested in was being able to measure climate change, to use a certain phrase, rather than to give you the weather forecast. In other words, we think of the opinion polls as being good at giving you the weather forecast, or maybe just told you what the weather's just been by looking at what's currently in the media agenda. British sociologists is trying to look at long-term change. And the report this year is in that spirit. So all the chapters this year are about long-term change. Many of them able to go all the way back to the 1980s. Now, typically, James is behind me. Typically, there are about 3,000 people interviewed each year, though not everybody gets asked all the questions. There's a bit of modularization. But in the post-pandemic environment, we've got over 6,500 people, but again, not everybody gets asked the questions. This was done at, we have to say, and this is the most recent survey, at a rather unusual time in our history. No sooner had the letters been sent out, and we heard sadly from Balmoral that the Queen had died. And by the time the survey was over, we had changed Prime Minister yet again. You may remember that time. But for the most part, given the kinds of things we're interested in, there's no particular reason to believe that this has any great impact. For those who are interested in things, it's funded on a modular basis. There are a variety of organisations, government departments, charity institutions, sometimes UKRI, who fund this survey. Okay, so that's the kind of prequel. One of the ways in which British social attitudes has been measuring changes in attitudes over the long run has been really trying to get at people's values rather than their attitudes to particular phenomena. Is ever since 1986, it's included a couple of scales, by which I mean we ask a series of questions of agree, disagree items, and we take all the answers to those questions to characterize whether somebody is A, left-wing or right-wing, or B, liberal or authoritarian. And you can see on the slide some examples of the kind of things. So by left and right, we mean, look, how concerned are you about inequality and what do you think the government should do about it? So you agree or disagree that there's one law for the rich and one for the poor, etc. Equally on liberal authoritarian, it's really about to what extent do you think society should be enforcing its social norms and its social values on its members, and it should be fairly authoritarian when people break societal rules, so schools should teach children to obey authority, etc., etc. So what I want to do is, first of all, to show you the trends in these, but Elizabeth's talk in particular is going to talk much more about the change on liberal authoritarian when she gets to that. But let me just give you this broad headline. So this is taking that scale and taking all the answers to all the questions. And 0 on this scale means you are extremely, extremely liberal. You mean the state should never, ever tell anybody anything to do. And 100 means you are extremely authoritarian. And the moment that somebody parks their car on a yellow line, they should be sent to jail for 20 years. Okay? And as you can see, well, we've tended to be relatively authoritarian, given the questions we ask. But you will notice that over the last decade or so, we have clearly moved in a somewhat more liberal direction. So now, you know, the score, and it's a somewhat artificial score in the scale, is 56, whereas it was around 70 back in the 1980s. And one of the things that's been consistently true, and again, this we'll talk about much more, younger people have always tended to be more liberal at any one point in time than older people, although today's older people are more liberal now than are the older people of the 1980s. And that is part of the story as to why we've become a more liberal society. So point one, therefore, is headline number 1. Insofar as one of the roles of the state is to enforce our social norms, our social values on society's members, We now want the state to do less of this, or at least we are more willing to allow individuals to decide these things for themselves. The second thing about left and right is, as I said, much more to do with what the government should be doing about inequality. And here you can see this much more of a cyclical pattern. So in 1983, again, 0 means you are extremely left-wing. You know, this is where Jeremy Corbyn would be. 100 is extremely right-wing. So let's put Liz Truss up there for the purposes of argument. We've tended to be on the left on this scale, but we've bounced up and down. We were at around, 37, 38 when the survey started asking these questions in the mid-1980s. By the time we get to the latter years of the new Labour government, we've moved to the right. One of the ironies of what we've found in the last 40 years is that Tony Blair was much more successful than Margaret Thatcher at moving Britain to the right. But it's not lasted. As you can see, we kind of moved back to roughly where we were in the 1980s by the time we got to the Conservative Liberal Democrat administration. And you will just notice we've just moved a bit to the left in the last few years. Now, I don't want to put this too far. We're not saying there's now some secular trend, but as a society, we are as far at that end of the spectrum as we have been in the last 40 years. And that perhaps is one piece of evidence, and I will come to some others, as to why, whatever the merits of what Liz Truss was trying to do 12 months ago, it wasn't necessarily brilliantly timed politically, given the mood of the public. Now, one of the things that I haven't got much time to talk about, but one of the things that's happened over the last 40 years is that age has become the biggest division in our electoral politics. Young people vote Labour, older people vote Conservative. So one of the things we said, well, is it true that young people are more left-wing than older people? Until very recently, the answer to that question was not particularly. But you will notice in the last few years, younger people have moved to the left. There is now a greater concern about inequality amongst younger people, perhaps related to their experience of the pandemic, which we might want to come back to. But before those of you on the left start ringing the celebration bells, there's going to be a warning coming down the track. The other thing that we did, we got Rosie Campbell and Rosie Shorrocks, who had done a lot about women in politics, to look at the attitudes of men and women over time. Is there a big difference? Short answer, no. Women are not more left-wing than men, indeed, at all. If anything, they're slightly further to the right, and that's been systematic. Now, to pursue the cyclical thing further, one of the things that British Socialites has asked literally every year since 1983 is whether or not, if the government has to choose, should taxes go up and spend more on health, education, and social benefits? Should it keep things as they are, or should it spend less? Now, it has to be said, very few people ever say spend less. The action is, do people say they want more, or do they say they keep things as they are? The green line is more, and the red line is keep as it is. Now, what you will notice is that gradually in the 1990s, as the Conservative government tried to keep the level of taxation down, but as waiting lists for the NHS got a wee bit long, the public said, actually, we're primarily concerned about the level of public spending. Took the new Labour government 2 years to cotton on to this, but eventually they did, and they turned on the spending taps, and lo and behold, by the time New Labour were about to leave office, the public was saying, thanks very much, lovely health service, could you now please tax us a wee bit less? In other words, the public react thermostatically to what's been happening, which is one of the reasons why attitudes were cyclical. And indeed, for a while, the early years of the Conservative-led administrations, that's where we were at. But since about 2015, 2016 or so, it's moved back again. But the interesting thing about where we are now is that even though in the wake of the pandemic, we have more or less record levels of taxation and more or less record levels of public spending, we have not as yet gone back. probably because we don't think public services are doing very well. But again, that's another reason why perhaps the Liz Truss expand was not timely. But here's the kind of paradox for those of you I warned you about. This is attitudes towards taxation and spending. Older folk in red and younger folk in purple. In the early years of British social attitudes, younger people tended to be a little bit more in favour of taxation and spending than older people. That changed around the late 1990s, and it's become quite a marked difference. Younger people are less keen on more tax. They might be more left-wing, but they're not as keen on more tax and spend. The interpretation we offer is, well, look, what's happened to the character of public spending. As we have aged as a society, it's more and more on health and social care that people of my age profit from. And meanwhile, what are young people who went to university having to do? They're paying a much higher rate of income tax for all practical purposes because they're paying off their tuition fees. So there is beginning to be evidence here of perhaps there's something of a generation gap in attitudes. The other reason why attitudes might be cyclical is to do with the shocks that we might suffer. There's a whole variety of questions that we've asked occasionally, asking people, do you or do you not think it should be the government's responsibility to provide a health service for the sick? To which the answer is nearly always yes. Help industry with what it needs to grow. That's more problematic. Find a job for everyone. Well, that's not usually something that most people think the government should be doing. But what you will notice is that by about 2006, when the age of globalization was in, we'd had 20, 30 years of pretty strong economic growth and a Labour government that wasn't desperately interventionist, we'd come to have lower expectations of the government. And then along came the financial crash and we wanted the government to rescue us. But we went back again. But you will now see post-pandemic, if anything, our expectations of what we think government should take on responsibility for are now as high as they have been. Another reason perhaps why Ms. Truss was not the right person for this time. One final area I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to shut up, attitudes towards welfare. And there's a whole chapter on this, so I'm just going to give you one example. So this is about whether or not people think the government should be spending more on welfare, even if it leads to higher taxes. And of course, both the new Labour administration of 1997 to 2010 was keen to spend less on welfare for those of working age. They criticised Margaret Thatcher's government for spending so much money on welfare when people could no longer work because of deindustrialisation. Their mantra was welfare to work. And meanwhile, of course, George Osborne focused a lot of his cuts on welfare benefits for people of working age. You will see that again, New Labour managed to change attitudes. And indeed, you can show that this change of attitude in a much less favourable attitude towards welfare occurred particularly strongly amongst those who are Labour identifiers. We have gone back since. The authors don't come to any very firm conclusion why, but it's partly to do with perceptions of poverty, perhaps a different media narrative, and yes, also, of course, the Labour Party has also changed its attitude to a degree. So, to conclude, there has been we're now a much more liberal society, but much more from Elizabeth. But politicians need to be aware that attitudes towards the role of the state tend to be cyclical, and that the public come at as a subject. Their attitudes depend on circumstances. But post-COVID, we do seem to have fairly high expectations, and we have not as yet as society reacted against the expansion of the state that has occurred in the wake of the pandemic. But meanwhile, there seems to be a bit of a generation gap in our attitudes towards both what government is delivering, but also inequality as well.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much to Rushton and John. I'm really delighted to be invited here today to talk about the findings of my chapter for the BSA 40th report, which focuses on our attitudes to moral issues and how those have changed over time. So the last 40 years are often characterised as having experienced a liberalisation in our attitudes. And I want to just challenge that assumption today by asking two key questions. So first of all, how universal is the idea that our attitudes have become liberal over the past 4 decades? And secondly, what are the drivers of that attitudinal change? So we're really lucky with the British Social Attitude Survey to have access to a huge wealth of data to help us answer these questions. Much of it going back to 1983, many questions asked at regular intervals using exactly the same wording year on year. In the chapter, I focus on 3 long-term sets of data on attitudes to sexual relationships, to marriage and to abortion. And I also look at some more recent data collected since 2016 on an emerging moral issue, namely people who are transgender. So my first chart focuses on how our attitudes to sexual relationships have changed over time, focusing specifically on premarital sex and same-sex relationships. Now, looking at this chart, it really does seem to endorse the idea of liberalisation in attitudes. The proportion who agree that there's nothing wrong with premarital sex has changed from 42% in 1983 to 76% now. Even more markedly, one of the biggest changes across the whole survey, the proportion of us who think there's nothing wrong with the same-sex relationships has changed from 17% in 1983 to 67% now. So clearly, movement in a liberal direction on both measures. However, as a corollary, we've also asked people across the same time period about their attitudes to extramarital sex. And here we find that little has changed at all. So back in 1983, 58% of us said that extramarital sex was always wrong. Today, the figure has barely changed at all, with 57% expressing that view. So clearly a degree of nuance. And when we move on to look at our attitudes to non-traditional family forms, we again see that the public are quite nuanced in this area as well. So we've got long-term questions on British attitudes on cohabitation, having children outside of marriage and single parenthood. And the data in relation to those items is presented on the slide behind me. Now, quite clearly, in relation to all 3 of those items, we have become more liberal since either the late 1980s or the early 1990s. So the idea that there's nothing wrong with a couple living together before getting married is now very widely accepted across the public. While single parenthood and having children outside of marriage have become more acceptable to the public, however, the picture today is basically of a society divided on these 2 issues. We're fairly split about whether we think these sorts of family formation are acceptable or not. So I would argue that liberalisation has moved more slowly when children are involved in non-traditional family forms, and actually we remain divided on these issues in 2022. Moving on to abortion, we see a similar degree of nuance in people's attitudes, and this was something we recognised back in the 1980s when we designed questions measuring public attitudes to abortion. So we appreciated that people might see abortion as being acceptable in some instances, but not in others. So we asked whether an abortion should be allowed in the 5 different scenarios presented on the slide behind me. Now, again, you can see the public's attitudes to abortion are nuanced. So in the top 2 scenarios where either the mother's health or the potential health of the baby are affected, you can see that more than 8 in 10 of us have always supported abortion being allowed, and actually that's remained fairly stable over time. However, in relation to the other 3 scenarios, where there's more of an element about parental or mother's preference in relation to abortion, actually, while our attitudes have become more liberal, we remain less supportive of abortion. So back in 1983, between 37 and 44% of us supported an abortion being allowed in each of those scenarios. In 2022, those figures have increased to a range between 67% and 76%. So a degree of liberalisation, certainly, but also an element of nuance in our attitudes to abortion as a moral issue. Now, in recent years on British social attitudes, they've also started asking about people's attitudes to people who are transgender, which obviously has gained a lot of political and media attention in the last decade or so. And the data here is really interesting and kind of presents a corollary to what I presented so far. So this data relates to people's self-described prejudice towards people who are transgender. And in 2016, 17, 18 and 19, slightly more than 8 in 10 of us said we were not prejudiced at all towards this group. So very stable. We then didn't ask the item again until 2022. And here, really quite surprising and marked change. So only 64% of us now describe ourselves as not at all prejudiced towards this group. And we see a similar sort of decline in liberal attitudes on another item, asking about whether people should be allowed to have their sex at birth changed on a birth certificate. So clearly, actually, attitudes here have moved in sort of an anti-liberal direction, and I'm going to come on to the reasons for that in the second part of my presentation. So in terms of what we've covered so far, in terms of the question of have we seen a liberalisation in our moral attitudes over the past 4 decades, I would argue that the concept of a liberalisation is something of a simplification. So clearly, the trend towards liberalisation, while evident across a range of areas, is not universal at all. Actually, our attitudes to extramarital sex haven't changed at all, and our attitudes to people towards transgender have become less liberal over the past 5 years. Similarly, there's clearly an element of nuance in our attitudes, which means some attitudes have shifted less slowly, particularly in relation to non-traditional family forms when children are involved, and in relation to abortion, where there's not a specific health issue implicated for the mother or the child. So in the second part of my presentation, I want to briefly focus on what the drivers of attitudinal change may have been, which is a particularly interesting question, given we've seen that the level and nature of change across the 4 areas has not been universal at all. So in the chapter, I set out 3 key theories as to why our attitudes to moral issues may have become more liberal. So first, I say that this may simply be a result of the changes of prevalence of various characteristics associated with liberal attitudes. And here I'm talking chiefly about education and religiosity. So clearly over the past 4 decades, society as a whole has become more highly educated, particularly with the expansion in higher education. And we've also become markedly less religious with a decline in church attendance and identification with religion. Given people who are more educated and less religious tend to be more liberal, it could be arguable that these 2 trends explain some of the changes I've shown already. Secondly, an alternative explanation. Obviously, some of the issues I've talked about have received considerable attention from politicians, from policymakers, from the media over the past 4 decades. And it also seems plausible that the public might have responded to some of that coverage and discussion, particularly, for example, same-sex relationships. The legislation and discussion in relation to those was obviously much more negative in the 1980s and moving to a much more positive position today. And the third theory as to why attitudes may have changed may simply relate to what people have experienced in their own lives. So I think people living today are much more likely to know someone who's had children outside of marriage, someone in a cohabiting relationship, someone who's openly gay than they were 40 years ago. And perhaps that commonality of experience has made us more liberal to some of these matters as well. So my final 2 slides basically present the results of some generational analysis where we've examined how the views of different generations have changed across the time period to try and understand which of these theories I've talked about are at play here. So just to explain, I've used kind of a rainbow theme with the oldest generation at the bottom being red, orange, yellow, the younger ones at the top being in the blue, purple and lilac, the final colours of the rainbow as well. So what I've depicted on this graph is typical of many of the attitudes we've looked at. So this chart shows disagreement with the view that people who want children ought to get married, and it shows it by generation. And I think what's really striking here is looking at those individual generations, actually, their views today are not that barely different to the views expressed in 1983. So what has driven change here? Quite clearly, it's the fact that newer generations have come of age who have more liberal attitudes. The older generations with less liberal attitudes have died off. And that's why a society, across society as a whole, we've seen a shift towards a greater liberalisation. And this is common across a whole range of attitudes that we examined in the chapter. However, it's not the whole story. It's also quite clear that public political discussion and legislation can impact on people's attitudes and can change the attitudes sometimes of society as a whole. And this is most clear in relation to attitudes to same-sex relationships. So this chart again shows the proportions of the different generations I just talked about who said that same-sex relationships were not at all wrong. Now, while you can see each individual generation line sort of rising slightly across the time period, that kind of denotes that actually the views of generations themselves have changed, and we're not simply seeing change in this area because older, less liberal generations are replaced by younger, more liberal ones. So when we look at the coverage of same-sex relationships, going back to the 1980s, we had the emergence of the AIDS, HIV pandemic. We had Section 26, where local authorities were prohibited from encouraging homosexuality in schools and so on. Moving forward into the 90s, where we've got the emergence of gay pride, moving onwards, where we've got civil partnerships being legislated for, moving forward to 2013, where gay marriage was allowed. So the whole discourse and legislation around this area became much more positive. And if you look at sort of the key periods of negativity in the 1980s, and that's increasing positivity in the 1990s, you can effectively see the public's view shifting in line for that, potentially driving some of that political change of discussion, but also potentially responding to it. So clearly we're more liberal today, not simply because of generational replacement, but also because we've responded to the views of our politicians, our media and so on. And just to note, this is also likely, I think, to be the case in relation to transgender. So I showed you earlier that with all people are more likely to express prejudice now towards people who are transgender. Further analysis for different subgroups suggests that's not limited to one group. It's evident in all sections of society. And it's quite likely that that's in response to the considerable and sometimes quite negative media political attention issues associated to those who are transgender has received over the last 5 years or so. So just to conclude, I wanted to end the chat by thinking about the future of our moral attitudes. So if we're all sitting here in 50 years looking at the BSA 50 data, what can we expect to see? So a few key points to emerge. Quite clearly, context matters. We cannot simply assume our attitudes to any particular issue are going to be more liberal in 10 years or not. What's going on in wider society clearly has the potential to have an impact. Now, for those areas where we have seen attitudes become liberal very slowly, simply because of generational replacement, older, less liberal generations dying off, replaced by younger ones, we might expect that process to continue, albeit slowly, and just to become even more liberal. However, on those areas where particularly attitudes to same-sex relationships and to transgender, where people are clearly being influenced by and responding to how these issues are dealt with by politicians and in the media, we can be less certain about what might happen next. And this is likely to be mediated to a considerable degree by how politicians and the media choose to address those issues. So I perhaps end by arguing that perhaps it's those issues that we are less likely to encounter in our own lives, where politics and media is more likely to have a role. So for example, most of us are likely to know a couple who are cohabiting, a couple who have had children without being married. And perhaps that's why there has been a gradual liberalisation in those areas, where perhaps we're less likely to know someone who's gay or who's transgender, and therefore our attitudes to those topics are more likely to be mediated by political and popular discussion, and as a result, more likely to be volatile in the future, but also have a less clear trajectory in terms of a further drive towards liberalism. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. This chapter looks at public attitudes towards class and tries to sort of scrutinise this oft-made claim that class in Britain has lost both its sort of social and political significance. Spoiler alert, there's a bit of a clue in the title what we found, but really the reasons for why the sort of salience of class are thought to have sort of diminished. I think they're also slightly problematic. So the general argument is kind of like expansion of education, modernisation, spread of affluence, undermined sort of the salience of class identities, blurred the boundaries between classes, increased mobility, led to classes being less distinctive and less salient features of people's lives. And accordingly, if classes didn't really have that coherence, then they were less likely to have coherent political values as well. I think this narrative was always problematic, but is worth kind of revisiting after, period of austerity, period of kind of like stalled social mobility, and the experience of the pandemic as well, to see whether we still kind of find evidence of this narrative. So we do three things to investigate public attitudes in the chapter. First, we look at class identity and class awareness, really thinking about how people identify themselves. So has class identity really waned? Do the public think of themselves increasingly as middle class? And do they believe that Britain has become a classless society? That is sort of like class barriers have diminished. Second section examines the sources of class identity. There have obviously been big changes in the structure of the labour market. Traditionally, sort of like manual working class occupations have declined. So who still thinks of themselves as working class? How has this changed over time? And is it still as closely tied to the occupation that people do as it was previously? And then the third section examines the political implications of some of these changes, looking at the extent to which sort of class identity and class awareness are politically important, and how they relate to sort of contemporary debates about sort of immigration on the one hand, inequality on the other, and mapping onto some of those value dimensions that John was talking about earlier to do with left, right, and liberal authoritarianism. So start looking at class identity and class awareness. And I think it's worth just spending a moment on how the question to measure class identity has been phrased, and also a little bit on how it's changed over time. So as John mentioned, the BSA for the last 40 years has predominantly been carried out face-to-face. And when it was carried out face-to-face, the class identity question was asked as an unprompted question. So do you ever think of yourself as belonging to any particular social class? And then respondents would answer generally along the lines of yes, middle class, working class, some other class, and the interviewer would code that. With the move to online surveys, the questions remained the same, but now respondents can see the response options. And seeing these response options might serve as a little prompt to declare a class identity slightly more readily than if they were asked it in a completely open-ended way. So I think, say that as a caveat, that we need to be a little bit careful about comparing data that we find now to previous years. But the BSA has also asked a follow-up question, which kind of prompts, almost forces people to declare an identity. And that's saying that most people say they belong to either middle class or working class. If you had to make a choice, would you call yourself middle class or working class? And this doesn't really tell us about the sort of salience of class identity and whether that's changed, but perhaps tells us something about the relative difference between middle class and working class identities. But we look at the unprompted question first, and what we find is that far from feeling all middle class now, people are much more likely to declare a working class identity, 46% do so, than a middle class identity, 29%. We also see that there's been a rapid change in the level of class identity since 2015, particularly in terms of declared working class identity, but also an increase in middle class identity. Part of that might be to do with the way in which the question is designed, but part might also reflect a real change. I think the broader pattern is that there's very little evidence of declining class identities. If we go right the way back to the 1980s, so looking at questions that are asked in the BSA, before that in the British election study, we repeatedly find that working class identity is higher than middle class identity. And from the 1980s to the 2010s, very little evidence of any change, despite these kind of like big changes to the structure of the labour market. If we turn to the prompted question, this wasn't available in 2022, but we can see it up to 2021. Again, very little evidence of any change. So it shows that these class identities really have been quite persistent over time, despite a lot of sort of social change, both kind of like economic and occupational. Second way in which we looked at class awareness was not just seeing how personally salient people felt it in their own lives, but how salient they thought it was in society as a whole. And so we asked them to what extent they think that social class affects someone's opportunities in Britain today. And again, rather than finding this kind of like story of sort of blurring class boundaries and move towards a more classless society, we find, if anything, the opposite. And this question isn't affected by the kind of mode effects that we discussed earlier. It's been asked in the same way over time. So in the last 10 years, the proportion of people saying that social class affects opportunities a great deal has increased from 22 to 28%, and the proportion saying it's declined, or not at all, has declined from 28 to 19%. And if we go right back to the beginning of the series in the 1980s, we'll see that people, if anything, think that social class affects opportunities more now than it did in the 1980s. Certainly, again, no evidence of any decline, and if anything, evidence of an increase. I think this story becomes even clearer if we look at a particular type of sort of class barrier, which is to do with occupational mobility and how difficult it is for people from one class move to another. And here the data goes back as far as 2005, but we see a really pronounced shift in public opinion. So from just 17% thinking it was very difficult in the new Labour era to 32% saying it's very difficult now. And I think that public attitude is borne out by objective reality as well, that social mobility has stalled, it has become harder, particularly for younger generations to maybe move upwards in the same way as it was for their parents and grandparents. And we find this feeling of kind of like class barriers to mobility particularly pronounced not only amongst those people who identify as working class, but amongst the young as well. So there's a clear generational divide here too. However, this kind of like personal perspective on class, where people feel it's a salient feature of their own identity, a salient feature of society at large, isn't mirrored by how important people think others consider class to be. Okay? So this is a question where we try and ask people to think, well, okay, we know that you care about class, but what about people in general? Do you think that that is a salient feature of like almost sort of like public discourse or public consciousness? And here we find the opposite trend to what we've found previously, that people think that on average, people are less concerned about class differences than they were certainly 10 years ago, and even as far back as 1983. So we see a bit of a mismatch between what people consider important to themselves, what they consider to be important in society, and what they then consider others to view important. So it may be that this is an area where they think there isn't that broad public or political attention, or it hasn't at least kept up with how they view the changing situation. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that it's a bit of a puzzle maybe that working class identity is still so high when a lot of these traditionally working class jobs have declined. So the next part looks at who identifies as working class. And I think there are a number of patterns that emerge from here. We still find that class identity is shaped quite strongly by sort of objective class location, the kind of jobs that people do, and people engaged in working class occupations much more likely than those in middle class jobs to identify as working class. But we also find strong education effects. And the difference between whether someone has been to university or not now has a greater influence in the type of job they do in terms of thinking about whether they're working class or not. And this has increased in importance over the years. So rather than blurring class boundaries, kind of spread of education might have kind of like reconfigured class identity in a way. And then we also see income effects. So kind of class identity is shaped by people's kind of sort of like sort of lived experience in terms of the kind of disadvantages that they may face in the labour market. But I think it's also shaped by broader social factors as well. And although there's a tendency to think about working class often in the debate about sort of like why sort of old men, the reality in terms of who identifies as working class is different. We find ethnic minorities are more likely to identify as working class than white British people. Find young people are more likely to identify as working class than older people. Don't find any gender differences and find really strong regional differences. And in fact, if we put all of this in kind of like a regression model, where you live has a stronger impact on your class identity, the region where you live, than the occupation that you do. Yeah. And so it's a much more salient feature of life or of identity, say in the north, than it is in the southeast or southwest. So lastly, we look at some of the political implications of this. I think, again, another common argument is that if classes have become more sort of heterogeneous, maybe their political preferences have become less clear-cut, and that might be why it matters less politically. I think we find some sort of mixed evidence on this. People who identify as working class still hold more left-wing values than people who identify as middle class, but the difference between them has reduced quite substantially over the last 10, 15 years. What we find is that there's this growing class gap on attitudes towards liberal authoritarian values, and particularly around sort of immigration, which has obviously been the source of a great deal of political debate over the last few years since Brexit. And there's also sort of like reshaped sort of political support with a move from sort of Labour to Conservatives. But I think a slightly different picture emerges if we look at the association between class awareness and political values. So we know that sort of people's perceptions of class barriers have increased, that people feel that Britain's become a more unequal place. And if we look at their values, we see that it's much more strongly related to left-right attitudes than it is to immigration or liberal authoritarian attitudes. And I think this sort of makes a certain amount of intuitive sense. You know, if you see inequality of opportunity as a big problem in society, you're going to be much more likely to favour those kinds of economic policies, which are the tools to try and address that. But if you don't consider it an issue, then maybe your attitudes are less related to these values. And so class awareness not only shapes political values, but even within sort of working class identifiers and middle class identifiers also dampens those anti sort of immigration attitudes that we see related to class identity. So I think there are a number of implications from this. I think the first is that kind of like the death or the decline of class in British society is probably greatly exaggerated. People continue to think of themselves in class terms, perhaps more than they did previously, but certainly no less. But much more clearly, they think that Britain has become a more unequal place, and that it's become harder for people from working class backgrounds to move up the occupational ladder, and that social mobilities stall. I think the political implications of this, I mean, is maybe for the political parties to think about, but often the kind of debate around sort of working class, and particularly the link to Brexit and immigration, has sort of been framed much more around these kind of like cultural attitudes towards liberal authoritarianism and immigration in particular. And we've seen those issues become more important in elections. But there's also this class awareness dimension. And for those people that are most concerned about inequality in Britain, I think the traditional left-right values still have much more salience. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Those were fascinating presentations. And I'm really keen to bring our panelists in who will each give a few minutes of reflections and responses on the results of this survey, anything they'd like to respond to that our speakers have highlighted as well. So we'll start with Jemima.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those incredibly interesting presentations. I'm Jemima Olhafsky. I'm the Chief Executive of the Persists Society. We campaign for gender equality and women's rights at home, at work, and in public life. And I'm really grateful to have the chance to reflect today on those chapters in the report around the gender gap, the differences in women's voting patterns, and on women and work. I want to talk a little bit about the good news and the rise in more progressive attitudes to women that come out of the survey, but also some of the challenges that we see for further change. So those are some persistently regressive attitudes around women, caring roles and the division of labour, and structures in the workplaces and around parental leave. And then I want to think a little bit about some of the political opportunities that I think come out of this. So first off, we do see increasingly progressive attitudes to the role of women. And obviously, as you'd expect me to say, hooray, that's great. So there's a decline in the proportion of people that think women should give up work when they have preschool children and solely focus on childcare while fathers work full time. So in 2012, 31% of people felt that was the best option. Women give up work and men continue to work full time for preschool children. That's now down to 18%. And the most frequently selected option for organising work and care was that women work part-time and dads work full-time. 33% of people select that. So there's progress, but you can also see that there's still a strongly embedded assumption that it is women that will take a lead on making shifts and balancing work and care where change is needed. And I think we shouldn't kind of gloss over as well that that does still mean a fifth of people nearly think the best thing, the right thing, is that women should be staying at home and men working full time. We also see in the survey that 1 in 10 people, more than 1 in 10 people, agree with the statement, a job is all right, but what women really want is a home and children. So these are still fairly common views, and they will be having an impact on women's experiences in the world and in the workplace, and indeed on public policy, which of course is dominated, our politics and our policy is dominated by men. Women are more likely to reject those traditional gender views. And one of the things I felt reading the chapter was a bit frustrated that the guys were lagging behind, and that even though with a majority, we're still having to kind of make the case that no, we know best for ourselves whether we want to go out and have a job or stay at home and raise a family. There's a really clear consensus in the data that domestic labour should be shared. So over 80% of people agree that women and men should share household shopping, preparation of the evening meal, cleaning, but 32% of men say they do less than their fair share. And 63% of women say they do more than their fair share. And I think that gap is really revealing. And it's partly the fact that we need to change some of our social policy infrastructure. Our parental leave system doesn't work effectively to support and encourage men to take time off work to care for children. And we know that that can create more balanced caring patterns and domestic labour patterns in households. But also, this is about men stepping up. Because if they are saying they think that they should be sharing, there is no major barrier to them picking up a J-cloth and getting cracking on. And if we are able to achieve that, we will see a huge difference in women's liberation from that second or maybe third or fourth shift that has a huge impact on their ability to participate in the workforce. So there is a clear expectation throughout that women will work, that they do now belong at work. And yet at the same time, more broadly, we have workplaces that expect them to behave and to work as if they were just like those men who don't have those additional responsibilities. So our workplaces aren't keeping pace with the changes in attitudes and people's sort of changing roles. So the gender pay gap, still just over 11% for those working full time, is in large part driven by women's concentration in part-time work and the related lower levels opportunities for progression that sees throughout their career and the suppressed wages. So we need quality, flexible working options, both so that women can work part-time and still progress, but also so that they can maybe work more hours, but in a flexible way that will enable them to progress and thrive and achieve their earning potential. And of course, that isn't just good for women, it's good for those managing health conditions, it's good for older workers, and it's good for men who may want to do more of that J-cloth work at home too. So Fawcett calls for all jobs to be advertised as flexible by default, so that employers start looking more proactively at what they can do to make it easier for women to move into those flexible roles. But practices in the workplace more broadly need to shift and move on too. So 40% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace. Our research with the Runnymede Trust found 75% of women of colour experience racism at work, and 27% have suffered racial slurs. So we have workplaces that are still not inclusive and welcoming to women, and in particular women of colour. And those practices need to change if we want to see women fully participate and thrive. So thinking a little bit about that and the section on the gender gap in voting, it looks at the change since 2017, where women are no longer more likely to vote for the Conservatives as they have historically been, and slightly more likely to vote for the Labour Party. And I guess the kind of overall finding is the jury's still out as to what's behind that trend, but it suggests that it might be down to the salience of the EU and the Brexit debate, with women having been a bit more likely to be Remain. And so it remains to be seen whether that pattern will continue. And what that says to me is, this is going to be an election that will belong to the party that can win those women's votes and that can step up and respond to those undecided women, or those women who are floating between parties. So we need, and the winning party will be one that offers investment childcare, we need flexible work, and we need to create working practices that are fit for the 21st century. Our polling shows that these are incredibly popular politically. They're more likely to make people vote for a party, that they're popular with women and men in the red wall seats, and they're popular across the political parties. And importantly, they're not polarizing. There's very low numbers of people, 4 or 5%, who say, I'd be less likely to vote for a party that endorses these. So we've got a real opportunity here with the next election to reshape the world a bit, where the reality of women's lives are much more closely aligned to our expressed preferences, as we see in this survey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now over to Seb.
Thank you very much. I've got just 5 brief points, reflections on the NatCen research, and I'm not really need to say this, but I think everyone agrees in the room what a valuable piece of work that it is. It's just unsurpassable as the gold standard for seeing how the country has changed. And for anyone who does any think tank work, any data analysis, there's nothing that comes near it. So thank you again very much to everyone on that. So the first thing I was reflecting on was about authoritarianism. And I think one thing we've learned is what a surprisingly authoritarian country Britain still actually is in many respects, that we like to think that it is, you know, the arc of social justice is bending in a sort of more liberal direction. But one thing that surprised me during the COVID pandemic was how willingly and able people went through the lockdown process, and how little backlash there was. There was in the media and the commentariat, of course, but amongst general voters, it just wasn't there at all. So, and based on the findings of this year, that's still there. And I think, you know, might not quite be locking up for 20 years if you park on a double yellow line, but I think there are certainly many things that I think we're going to see in policy debates, particularly, for example, when you look at protesters, you know, the public opinion on Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion shows that actually people do still want to act very tough. And even though we like to think of ourselves as liberal, I do sort of wonder how much we are on that front. The role, and that feeds into the role of the state. And a lot of the work we've done at Onward is about how people's attitudes are no longer in the classic left-right thing. And obviously, as John highlighted, there is a cyclical fashion to this, that people want more spending and then they want tax cuts, or often what we find is they want more spending and they want tax cuts as well, which I think there was a certain prime minister tried that and we saw how that went. But I think ultimately, this is what's going to be very interesting. We look toward the 2024 general election. There are going to be some clear dividing lines on tax and spend between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of what they want. But ultimately, their visions are not that different, really, if you look at how they view the role of the state here. That even with yesterday's net zero announcement, Rishi Sunak was very much emphasizing this element of individual responsibility here, saying that actually we are doing so well individually that we don't need these government mandated targets to try and hit our net zero commitments. But he's combining that with also increasing state support in terms of replacing boilers. So this kind of era that we're in now is not very much yes state, no state. And I think that's going to be a very interesting one to see how that develops, particularly as we face the economic challenges as demographics get older and make things much more difficult. The third thing I wanted to reflect on as well is age here as well. And Sir John in his opening remarks referenced the fact that younger people are markedly more left-wing. And we've done quite a lot of work on this onward with my great colleague, James Blankton, who's in the front row here, on millennials. Now, millennials, which were those who were born between 1983 and the turn of the millennium, depending on what definition you want to follow there, they are the first generation who are becoming not more right-wing as they get older, but also becoming more left-wing as they get older. And I think part of that is reflected on their experiences of the post-financial crisis economics market of COVID. And this is going to pose some very interesting trends that I'll be fascinated to see in future NatCen shows about how this goes. Now, obviously, age has become the dividing line for political parties, and this comes on to the class question I'll reflect on later. That in 1987, Margaret Thatcher won the majority of not only 24 to 35-year-olds, but also almost the majority of 18 to 24-year-olds as well. And that's sort of unthinkable when you look about where the age profile is now in terms of voting bases. And what we found there is that on the surface, millennials are people who look to be more interested in inequality, more interested in distribution. But when you actually nail down, do you want government to do that? Onwards research says, well, actually, no. So they have this kind of, obviously, as voters often do, want to everything, every way, all at once. But I think what you see with millennials is that we describe them as shy Tories in the sense that or shy capitalists, I should say. So shy Tories being 1992 elected, but the shy capitalists within them are ones who don't want the state to redistribute money on their behalf, but they are interested in inequality. And I think making the case for that from a centre-right perspective, as we do at Onward, is going to be something that will play a role in, I think, in the coming decade of politics. Because otherwise, if this is not tackled, as we have warned at Onward, in 10 years' time, when you're 30, 35-year-olds should be natural conservative voters, they won't be. And there won't be a voting base for centre-right parties if this trend is not looked at in a clear way. The fourth thing as well on the liberalisation and social attitudes that you were talking about, Elizabeth, the transgender thing is a fascinating one to see about how that has changed. It's become such a prominent issue, as such a prominent topic. But again, it's not one that goes in traditional left-right divides on this, that you see many people who on many other areas would be on the left side of politics. You can think of many left-wing writers like Janice Turner at the Times, or Hadley Freeman, or Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP, yet have very strong views on the transgender debate there. And I think when you look at the attitudes towards same-sex marriage and homosexual relationships, the lesson for that is taking people with you. And I think it was very striking that you've seen that market change since it was a Conservative government that put that into law. That I think if that had been done by a more progressive government, I think it would be interesting to see how those attitudes would have looked different. That David Cameron did it in a very conservative way, focusing on the element of family in that. And I think when we look at where the transgender debate goes next, hopefully to a slightly less contentious and more consensual place, it is about taking voters on the journey with you. And obviously we're still waiting for guidance from the government on where they're going to go on that, but that is the crucial element. And the final thing I just wanted to reflect on from the presentation was about class here. That a couple of years ago, I wrote a book about the Red War, where I went around many parts of the country that had voted Conservative for the first time in living memory, sometimes forever. And what I thought was interesting there is these places are palpably, in many cases, richer than they were in their industrial prime. The example I always use is Concert in County Durham, which had the big steel works there that closed in 1980. When the steel works closed, unemployment rose to 36%. 20,000 people lost their jobs in the space of several years. It's gone through several rounds of regeneration to the point at which it voted Conservative for the first time in 2019. And when I went around Concert, you could see you had big new private housing estates. You had Beamers and Audis. And I mean, the steelworkers did not have Beamers and Audis when they were there. And when you went to a pub in the centre of Connaught, some guy was telling me about his 3-week cricket tour of the East Indies. And I was like, that in concert, you know, that shows how even though these places have become wealthier, they still have huge problems in terms of being unequal, that what defines people, what people think of themselves as working class is very, very different to as it was before. We can look at it in terms of manual professions, people who come from different backgrounds, whether they've been to university or not. But the thing that I took away from the book is that people who live in places that traditionally felt working class means that they are working class, even if they work in jobs that would feel much more middle class. So it's far more complex about what people feel about this. It doesn't surprise me whatsoever, to Oliver's point, that everyone says they're working class. You know, obviously John Prescott famously said we're all middle class now, but maybe we've been listening to too much John Lennon and we're all now working class now. But those are some reflections for me on that, and thank you again for some great work.
Thank you so much. And now Lalitha.
Thanks, Anush, and thank you so much for the presenters who have shown us your brilliant work today, and everyone who's worked on the report and the research. As everyone said, the British are such a good resource. So I'm going to speak today a bit about the chapter on attitudes to welfare and poverty. So I'm an economist at the Resolution Foundation, and I work on welfare and living standards. And it's a really important time to be talking about welfare at the moment for a few reasons. So looking back to the recent past, welfare has been a really important part of supporting people's incomes during crisis, right? So we've just had the COVID pandemic and the current cost of living crisis, but this support has actually come from temporary boosts to the system. So crisis-related boosts, not from the existing system we have. And then looking at the current situation, the government are making decisions around benefit uprating for next year. So there's a decision over whether the state pension should follow the triple lock and be uprated by 8.5% using the earnings element. And then there's also questions over whether the government will uprate working benefits by inflation or by less than that. And then looking further forward to a bit further into the future, Resolution Foundation research has shown that over the next 10 years, if policy continues the way it is, income growth is going to be unequal. So low and middle income households' incomes are going to grow a lot slower than high income households. And part of that is because the benefit system isn't keeping up with earnings growth. So onto the survey, the survey's shown a fall in anti-welfare attitudes. So people are less likely to agree that people who get social security don't deserve any help. And more people also think the government should be spending more money on benefits for poor people, even if it leads to higher taxes. What I also found quite interesting is that this fall in anti-welfare attitudes has happened across the board. So it's regardless of political affiliation, age, or education. So it's not very surprising to me that people have become more in favor of welfare spending over the last decade or so. And that's because support has been withdrawn from the system through a couple of different ways for working age people. So the first one of these is that benefits haven't kept up with inflation. So there's been a series of below inflation increases over the last 15 years or so. And that means that the real value of unemployment benefits have fallen by 13% since 2010. However, on the other hand, the real value of the state pension has risen by 8% over the same period due to the protection that the triple lock gives it. There's also been a series of policies designed to restrict benefits for certain groups, such as the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. And then looking at the rest of the report, I think there's a couple of really interesting related findings. So the fact that perceptions around poverty have changed, more people think there's quite a lot of poverty in Britain, and then listening to Oliver talking about class as well, I think it's quite interesting that people are more likely to feel working class. And I think part of that is down to what's been happening to income. So people don't particularly feel well off because income growth has stagnated over the last 15 years. So for example, over the course of this parliament, families across the income distribution have seen the worst income growth compared to any parliament on record. And then if you also look at income growth in the UK compared to other countries, ours has definitely been weaker. So between 2007 and 2018, only Greece had worse income growth than us in Europe. Looking forward to the future, changes to welfare are set to worsen household income. So we've had the cost of living payments this year and last year, which have been really good for helping struggling families during the cost of living crisis. However, at the moment, there's not set to be any next year. So that means that incomes for the poorest half of households are set to fall in real terms. And if benefits aren't uprated by inflation, they will fall even further. So going into an election year, all parties should definitely be aware of what's in this report. People are more pro-welfare spending, they're more pro-helping people that need it than they have been over recent years, and they should very much be creating policy accordingly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Grant.
Thanks so much. So it's my job to really just welcome you all here. So I am Managing Director of Research and Information and House of Commons Librarian. So welcome to Portcullis House and welcome to UK Parliament. So two very important things happened in 1983. One was the first British Social Attitude Survey, which you've all heard about. The other was I was born. And so it's been very nice that NatCen has carried out a survey each year of my life so I can track social attitudes during that time. And the introduction of the current year's survey talks very much about what we do in this place. So when it comes to thinking about domestic roles of the UK Parliament, the first is taxation and spending, and we've heard a lot about the cyclical nature of public views on tax and spending. And the second is debating the issues of the day and passing legislation, and we've heard how that may have liberalised over time. The purpose of the House of Commons Library and the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, both of which I have the privilege to look after, is to provide the information, the research and analysis on all areas of public policy. And we do this to support MPs, to support their constituents, to help them debate in the chamber, to give guidance on legislation, and also to scrutinise the work of government. And we're trusted because we are completely impartial in the way we do that. We simply provide the evidence base, we provide the research evidence, the other types of evidence that are out there, and we are therefore very reliant on the sources that we use. And NatCen's work and the British Social Attitude Survey, because it's so trusted, because it's so methodologically robust, because it takes a very balanced approach at what it has asked over the years and continues to report, is very important to many of our briefings and the ways we can tell MPs what British public actually think about things. So I was trying to think about, when we're asked questions from MPs. So as well as publishing over 1,200 briefings a year on different topical aspects of public policy, MPs can ask us questions more or less about anything. And we answer about 19,000 of these research questions a year. And what many of those are about statistics or are about particular questions where often we are simply providing a point in time figure. So if we took the report, for example, we can say now that 39% of people who were surveyed think that mothers and fathers should share paid parental leave equally. What the BSA allows us to do because of this time series is to actually say why that's relevant, how that's changed over time. And we know simply in the last 10 years that that's doubled, that 39% has doubled from about 20% in 2012. So it provides us lots of information about these generational changes, and as John said at the start, whether these changes are secular or cyclical. And so just looking through some of the questions that we've been asked recently that we've used the British Social Attitude Survey to answer, those have been things like satisfaction with the NHS, which unsurprisingly is at its lowest at the moment since the BSA started. trust in politics, and we have a briefing on trust in politics at the library. The indicators of gender equality and being able to draw upon this information to say how that's changed over the past 40 years. The public perception of science and innovation and technology and how that's changed. And then most recently, the perception on church schools admissions and how the change in attitudes to religion have changed how people feel about those. Just looking at both chambers, so the House of Commons and House of Lords, NatCen research in this parliamentary session has been quoted about 20 times. So it's very much valued by members, it's very much valued by the library. So this was why the House of Commons Library and Post were very happy to support this event and host this event. And hopefully we'll now have some very interesting questions. And then we invite you to stay for coffee and drinks afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for your reflections on the fascinating results of the survey. I do want to give people a chance for questions, but I just want to ask my own selfishly before we go over to the audience. We've had such a rich insight into how the British public feels currently, but also how that's changed over time. What do you think political parties are misunderstanding about where the British public is at the moment, and sort of what should they change in their offer to voters? I mean, you mentioned the election coming up. There's a few microphones, so you might have to pass them along.
It's just the question I would expect a journalist to ask, Nanush. Yeah, you're not interested in what's happened in the last 40 years. You want to know what's going to happen in the next 12 months. I mean, I think the answer to you is that, I mean, Sebastian referred to some of this in his remarks, is that, you know, as I said more than once and perhaps once too often, you know, the attempt to row back the role of the state 12 months ago wasn't particularly well timed, and that therefore governments, parties need to realize that at the moment, at least, the public have relatively high expectations of what government ought to achieve, though they're not necessarily satisfied that they're achieving a great deal. And that in the post-pandemic environment, despite the high levels of taxation, we don't seem to have said time to row back. Now, of course, there's one fundamental difference between the position now and before 1997. And I think I've already indicated, you know, before 1997, before Labour won, it was very clear, actually, from BSA and lots of other evidence that the public were primarily concerned about the state of public services. But Labour, because their interpretation of what happened in 1992, I mean, I heard Donald Dewar, God rest his soul, say it in public. I do not believe them, okay? The difference now, of course, is that even if you believe what the public say, the fiscal position is very, very different. So the other challenge to government is, how are you going to improve the public services and meet the public's seemingly relatively high expectations in a circumstance where, I mean, put it, it's not too colloquially, the state's already maxed out its credit card. And I think you've already seen the Labour Party in some of its moves, which some people interpret as, you know, New Labour Mark II, but frankly is also a recognition of the fiscal constraint that next government will face, because a lot of the fiscal difficulty has been kicked down to after the election. But equally also, you saw how the public reacted, and less than the Conservative Party, you saw how the public react to small state conservatism. The challenge clearly to Rishi Sunak, and, you know, maybe yesterday was the beginning of his attempt to deal with this, is, so what is the vision the Conservative Party is going to present to people of how the state's going to be used, and what is going to be the relationship between the state and industry in order to deal with some of the problems we're dealing with, including climate change. Now, the question is whether or not either party can come up with a clear response to that challenge. I'm not sure that either of them have done so yet, but, you know, that's, I suspect, some of the lessons at least they should be taking on board.
Yeah, I think that they are sort of under optimistic about the popularity of some of those reforms that will support women to participate. So our polling that, representative survey and red votes seats that had gone Labour to Tory at the last election found 75% of women in those seats and a similar proportion of men said they would be more likely to vote for a party that was going to significantly invest in childcare. And it's been framed as an issue that's sort of an expense and perhaps as something you might do to appease a group of voters. But I think they're missing out on the extent to which this is vital to solving other political and economic problems, i.e. we've got women leaving the workforce in higher numbers because of their caring responsibilities. We've never invested more in women's education. We've got a higher number of women graduates than men now, yet they are unable to fully participate because of the cost and the availability of childcare. When you invest in that, you unlock skills and potential. It's a response to our productivity, our skills crisis, and of course to the cost of living crisis. So I think they can be a bit bolder, both parties, both main parties, in addressing that.
I'm going to leave that actually because we get time for more questions.
Okay.
Hi. Do you want us to announce names and? Okay. All right. No, it's a general question, possibly aimed at Sir John. I'm Steve Barnett, University of Westminster. I've got a question on squaring that circle of taxation and public spending. But first, I just want to echo what Sir John said about the tribute to Sir Roger Jowell, who I knew quite well in the early 80s. I had a number of conversations with him when he was trying to get this off the ground. And I have to confess, I was slightly dubious. And without Roger's vision and determination, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you for mentioning his name. My question is this. It seems to me that because it's 40 years old, some of the questions around taxation may be a little bit too blunt for some of the political options that are available today. And I just wonder whether the divisions that have been found about people wanting more public spending but wanting less taxation might be squared through more focused questions on the nature of that taxation, because people do see inequality around them. And that's an inequality based on wealth rather than income. And that difference in wealth inequality, which is about assets, it's about shares, it's the fact that they see the prime minister, multi-millionaire paying 21% in taxes, whereas most people are paying between 35 and 40% if you take into account national insurance. So is there a way in which we can look more in a more focused way at public attitudes to perhaps capital gains tax and a bigger investment tax, changes in council tax, etc., which I think would help possibly an incoming progressive government?
Yeah, I'll have a go at Steve's point. I mean, thank you, Steve. The first rule of survey design, if you're trying to do this kind of long-term change, is that the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. Yeah, I mean, we are stuck with what Sir Roger and his colleagues came up with in 1983, most notably Sharon Witherspoon, who used to run the Nuffield Foundation. So what you're beginning to do, Steve, is to craft the introduction to what sounds to me like a very interesting grant application to UKRI ESRC for undertaking funding in this area. We have in the past done some work of this kind, going much more in detail about attitudes towards various aspects of this issue. And I have noted what you said, and if there's anybody out there who's an academic who is listening on Zoom, or indeed anybody in the room who has expertise in this area, by all means talk to any of us at National Centre. We will be all ears, because one of the ways we do raise money is by doing in-depth academic research with academics and using British social attitudes as the platform. So thank you, Steve, for planting that idea into the wider public domain.
There was a question here. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. Suzanne McGregor, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My first point is a general comment that the picture that you paint over the 40 years is really quite encouraging, where we get a picture of the public being really quite rational, so that we see attitudes responding to events and situations, perhaps not immediately, but generally, in a way which is encouraging for democratic politics. But my question then is that I was struck that no one on the panel used that fashionable word polarization. So we heard nothing about polarization. So are you actually feeling that we should also be quite confident about the shape of our society, that we're not heading down the American route in any way, but we can actually become quite consensual and reach agreement?
Great question, thank you. Elizabeth, I wonder if you wanted to come on that.
Yeah, so certainly in the data I presented today for my chapter, you can see that with the whole concept of polarization, which I didn't actually mention in the chapter, would again, be a simplification. So on some issues, we're more unanimous now than we were 40 years ago. So things like cohabitation, we're more supportive of, abortion, we're more supportive of in a range of scenarios. On other issues, we're actually more divided as a society than we were 40 years ago. So things like single parenthood, having children outside of marriage, we're kind of almost split down the middle, for and against, whereas 40 years ago, most of us were against. So from a moral issues point of view, I think, polarization, again, I come back to context matter. It's a simplification. You have to look at the specific issues to see what our thinking was before, how it's moved on, how it might move on in the future as well.
Say something about class, because kind of look at this indirectly. I think there's been kind of like bounded polarization. So if you look at attitudes towards immigration, they've moved in a more pro-immigration direction, but the differences between, say, working class and middle class have become more pronounced. So on the one hand, there's increased polarization, but on the other hand, there's increased liberalization. And I think you sort of see almost the opposite in reverse with left-wing attitudes, that both society as a large has moved in a left-wing direction, but this has been greater amongst middle-class identifiers and working-class identifiers. So you see a decrease in polarization. So it's kind of whether it's the relative difference or the absolute position gives you a slightly different picture, I suppose.
And just very quickly, putting on my own journalist hat for a moment here, because I've worked in the UK and in America, and I think one thing that's remained consistent throughout the last 40 years is that we have a national broadcaster that creates a base level of fact, shall we say, in terms of when things was on the BBC. America does not have that, and I think that a lot of the polarization, their politics, is a direct result of that. So even though the media landscape has changed hugely since NatCen started, I think our media is in a much healthier place, and I think that plays into a role why, even whatever newspaper or channel or whatever you want to go, there are sort of bounds almost in terms of what the facts of where things are put forward there. And I think that's quite an underappreciated thing about how we still have more cohesion in terms of where the debate is than, say, America.
Jeff Rooker, House of Lords. My declaration of interest is many years ago, somebody knocked on my door. And I went through the full face-to-face. And occasionally, maybe a couple of times a year, I still get now the online surveys. My question relates to the word that nobody's mentioned, even though I realise what we're talking about is 40 years looking at it, and that's Brexit. How long will it be before you're able to identify, if it's possible, any changes in British social attitudes that can be directly nailed to Brexit? I mean, we've only been out 2 years, I realise that. Referendum was a long time ago. But is this something you're thinking about in terms of trying to measure, bearing in mind, if there isn't an effect, then okay. But is there an effect, and will you be measuring it?
Jeff, believe it or not, one of the vows that we took this year was not too much politics. Okay, we deliberately decided to focus because the survey is, in terms of long-term changes in attitudes, the survey is richest in that area. You can probably anticipate that next year's report will have a bit more politics in it because there might be a wee election coming along. I mean, on Brexit, generally, I mean, we've not pursued the particular question you are interested in on BSA. I have a separate project which is being run by NatCen, using the NatCen panel, indeed, on attitudes towards Brexit. And one of the things that's talking about is how, although the Labour Party thought that the only way it would ever manage to get to 45% in the opinion polls was by making the kinds of people who vote for it much more orientated in the direction of being wanted to be outside the European Union, that has not proven to be the case. Labour's vote is as pro-EU now as it was back in 2019. It's just got a lot more people, and there are lots of complicated reasons about how attitudes towards Brexit has changed. That has meant that although Labour, until about the last 2 weeks, kept silent on Brexit, it's not actually been particularly successful in making the people who vote for it, people who are more orientated towards the stay out of the EU direction, which does mean that the next Labour government, if it is another Labour government, will find itself backed by about 3 to 1 by people who want the UK to rejoin the European Union.
England dominates Britain numerically, but we've now had 24 years of political devolution, and that became particularly prominent during the pandemic period. What evidence is there from the survey of statistically different attitudes between respondents in England, Scotland, and Wales? I think that was in relation to John's presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, and there was some regional differences in class identity.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's certainly, strong regional differences in class identity, particularly Scotland had a stronger sense of working class identity, not necessarily distinctively to England, but distinctively to parts of England in the southeast and southwest. But I wouldn't necessarily say that was a particularly Scottish thing. We see equally strong working class identity in the north, maybe a little bit less in Wales. So perhaps stronger regional differences than there are differences between the devolved regions.
I mean, the broader answer to the question is British social attitudes started in 1983, and we were interested in long-term change. So we deliberately focused on Britain. We have been running since 1999 a separate Scottish social attitude survey. Getting that back up and running in full gear since the pandemic has been more challenging, but we're gradually getting there. Certainly, we are, for example, one of the things that we're fielding this year that we'll be able to report next year is part of an international project of which British social attitudes and Scottish social attitudes part, about national identity and attitudes towards national identity and some things associated with that. And we will be running the survey separately in Scotland from that across the UK as a whole. And so that will certainly produce some work. But yes, there is, if you look at previous British social attitudes reports, you will see occasional chapters on how attitudes in Scotland are different, or about in particular how attitudes towards the constitutional question in Scotland, which of course is a particular issue north of the border, have evolved during the course of time.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for. I'm aware that not everyone got to answer each of the questions. So does anyone have anything they want to come in on before we finish the discussion? No? Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our speakers for a fascinating discussion, as well as the House of Commons Library for hosting us as well, and to all of you and our attendees online too. This has all been live streamed, so you can go back and watch it via YouTube, and a copy of this year's report will be shared with everyone who's attended. And please do stay on for refreshments and networking.